Hi there. It's story time with Grandma Kay. I'm sorry I missed a couple of days with you because I hurt my finger, but I'm doing much better. So we're back to story time. Today's story is Good Work, Amelia Bedelia by Peggy Parish. Amelia Bedelia called Mr. Rogers. Is the coffee ready? Coming right up, said Amelia Bedelia. She poured a cup of coffee. She took it into the dining room. There, said Amelia Bedelia. Would you like something more? Yes, said Mr. Rogers. Toast and an egg. Fine, said Amelia Bedelia. She went into the kitchen. Very quickly, Amelia Bedelia was back. Mr. Rogers picked up the egg. He broke it over his toast. Confound it, Amelia Bedelia, I didn't say raw egg. But you didn't say to cook it, said Amelia Bedelia. Mr. Rogers threw down his napkin. Oh, go fly a kite, he said. Amelia Bedelia looked surprised. All right, she said, if you say so. It's got messy hands, huh? Soon Amelia Bedelia was out in a field. She had a kite. Now that was nice of Mr. Rogers, she said. I do love to fly kites, but I better get back. Mrs. Rogers might need me. He didn't really mean that, did he? But she took it literally. She's so funny. Sure enough, Mrs. Rogers was calling. Amelia Bedelia. Here I am, said Amelia Bedelia. There's a lot to do, said Mrs. Rogers. Do you know how to make bread? I can make good cornbread, said Amelia Bedelia. No, I want white bread, said Mrs. Rogers. You're a good cook. Just do what the recipe says. All right, said Amelia Bedelia. Here's a list of other things I want you to do, said Mrs. Rogers. I'll be out until dinner time. Don't worry, said Amelia Bedelia. I'll get everything done. Mrs. Rogers left. Looks like the list is pretty long, huh? I'll start with that bread, said Amelia Bedelia. She read the recipe. Do tell, she said. I never knew bread did such magic things. Amelia Bedelia got everything she needed. Quickly, she mixed the dough. What do you think she's talking about? Amelia Bedelia set the pan on the table. Now, she said, you're supposed to rise. This I've got to see. Amelia Bedelia sat down to watch, but nothing happened. Maybe you don't like to be watched. I'll come back, said Amelia Bedelia. She thought the bread was going to get up off the table by itself. You think that's what she meant? Let's see. Amelia Bedelia got her list. Clean out the ashes from the parlor fireplace. Fill the wood box. Amelia Bedelia went into the parlor. She cleaned out the ashes, and Amelia Bedelia filled the wood box. She's making a mess. That's done, said Amelia Bedelia. What's next? She read, Pop the window box plants. Put the pots in the parlor. Amelia Bedelia went outside. She counted the plants. Then she went into the kitchen. My goodness, she said, I need every pot for this. So she took them all. Amelia Bedelia potted those plants, and she took them inside. She took all the pots from the kitchen, put flowers in them. She's such a silly lady. Now, I better tend to that bread, said Amelia Bedelia. She went into the kitchen, but the bread still sat on the table. Now look here, she said, you're supposed to rise. Then I'm supposed to punch you down. How can I punch if you don't rise? Amelia Bedelia sat down to think. Maybe that pan is too heavy, she said. I better help it rise. Amelia Bedelia got some string. She worked for a bit, and that bread began to rise. That should be high enough, she said. Said Amelia Bedelia, I'll just let you stay there for a while. She hung it on the light. It rose because it's up in the air, but that's not what it means, huh? She's silly. Amelia Bedelia picked up her list. Make a sponge cake. Amelia Bedelia read that again. I know a lot about cakes, she said, but I have never heard tell of that. But if she wants a sponge cake, I will make her a sponge cake. Amelia Bedelia put a little of this and some of that in a bowl. She mixed and mixed. Now for the sponge, she said. Amelia Bedelia got a sponge. She snipped it into small pieces. There, she said, into the cake you go. Yuck. Think that would taste okay? Soon the sponge cake was baking. I don't think Mr. Rogers will like this cake, said Amelia Bedelia. I'll make my kind of cake too. He does love butterscotch icing. So Amelia Bedelia baked another cake. There, she said, I'll surprise him. Amelia Bedelia put butterscotch cake in the cupboard. She put the sponge cake on the shelf. My, this is a busy day, said Amelia Bedelia. Let's see what's next. Call Alkaloo. Ask him to patch the front door screen. Amelia Bedelia shook her head. Alkaloo can't patch anything, she said. I can do better that. I better do that myself. She got what she needed. What do you think she's going to do? And Amelia Bedelia patched the screen. She put all kinds of fabric on the screen, didn't she, with her needle and thread and scissors. Amelia Bedelia looked at the time. Oh, she said, I had better get dinner started. Let me see what she wants. She read the list. A chicken dinner will be fine. Amelia Bedelia shook her head. What will she think of next, she said. Well, that didn't take long to fix. Amelia Bedelia got everything ready. She set the table, then she sat down to rest. She's been working hard. Even though she's doing silly things, she's still working hard, isn't she? Soon Mr. and Mrs. Rogers came home. Amelia Bedelia, yelled Mr. Rogers. Coming, called Amelia Bedelia. What is that awful cloth on the front door? Said Mrs. Rogers. You said to patch the screen, said Amelia Bedelia. Can't patch without a patch. They're not happy, are they? They went into the parlor. Oh, my good pots, said Mrs. Rogers. And the bad ones, too, said Amelia Bedelia. Mr. Rogers looked at the wood box. He shook his head, but he didn't say a word. They went into the kitchen. The sponge cake is pretty, said Mrs. Rogers. At least that's done right. All the mess. Wait till they taste that sponge cake. Oh, what do you think? Dun, dun, dun. Something caught Mr. Rogers' eye. He looked up. What in tarnation is that? He said. The bread, said Amelia Bedelia. I plumb forgot it. Do let me punch it down quick. She climbed up on a chair. Amelia Bedelia began to punch. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers just stared. Oh, silly lady. Silly Amelia Bedelia. The bread plopped to the floor. Did I see what I thought I saw? Said Mr. Rogers. You did, said Mrs. Rogers. Now, said Amelia Bedelia, dinner is ready when you are. Well, you can cook, said Mrs. Rogers. Dinner should be good. I hope so, said Mr. Rogers. I'm hungry. Just serve the plates, said Mrs. Rogers. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers sat at the table. Amelia Bedelia brought in the plates. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers stared at the plates. But it's cracked corn. It's all kinds of awful things, said Mrs. Rogers. You said chicken dinner, said Amelia Bedelia. That's what chickens eat for dinner. Mrs. Rogers was too angry to speak. Take this mess away, said Mr. Rogers. She gave him chicken food. Mrs. Rogers said, serve the cake and coffee. Amelia Bedelia did. Mr. Rogers took a big bite of cake. He sputtered and spit it out. What in tarnation is that? He said. Sponge, said Amelia Bedelia. Mrs. Rogers said to make a sponge cake. Can you imagine? What a terrible trick. Suddenly, Mr. Rogers laughed. Ha, 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 he roared. Ha, 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 ha. Mrs. Rogers looked at the lumpy cake. Then she laughed too. Ha, 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 ha. But I'm still hungry, said Mr. Rogers. I can fix that, said Amelia Bedelia. I have a surprise for you. Oh, no, said Mr. Rogers. I can't take another one, said Mrs. Rogers. They're a little bit scared, aren't they? Amelia Bedelia brought in milk and her butterscotch cake. Ah, said Mr. Rogers. Hurry, said Mrs. Rogers. Give me some. And soon the whole cake was gone. How do you do that, Amelia Bedelia, said Mr. Rogers. 1 minute we're hopping mad at you, and the next we know we can't do without you, said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia smiled. I guess I just understand your ways, she said. The end. I love you. Hope you enjoyed the silly story. Have a great day.